It has been about a month and a half since Japan first slapped export curbs against Korea, triggering a trade battle between the two nations. Korea has completed gathering public opinion on the removal of Japan from its whitelist of trusted partners this week, and it's expected to announce its amended export controls on strategic items as early as next week. On top of Seoul Tokyo trade tensions, external uncertainties still linger. And today we go in depth on the economic challenges Korea faces and what we can expect ahead. For that, Dr. Soo-young, professor of finance at Chung Ang University, joins me in the studio. It's good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So Korea will soon announce its amended export controls, officially removing Japan from its whitelist. Could you first make a comparison for us on Korea's removal of Japan and Japan's removal of Korea from their respective whitelists? What do those measures mean to one another?
Yeah, first, the Japanese removal of Korea from the whitelist is officially the Prime Minister of Japan, Abe Shinzo, has announced that Korea has to keep the 1965 agreement between the two countries. So, and also the forced labor workers during the colonial era should not be allowed to take wealth out of the current Japanese firms' assets. So that is because of the political issue. Then, as a pressure, Japanese government has adopted this kind of withdrawal of the preferential treatment, which was allowed for all the other advanced countries around the world, even Argentina, who is poorer than us, clearly. So to that regard, the Japanese government withdrawal of the removal of the Korea whitelist is political. However, Korea's government, technically speaking, the current balance between Korea and Japan is always negative for Korea because we import much more than export. So economically, it does not affect much, even though Korean government has adopted removal of the Japan out of the whitelist. But however, it has some symbolic gesture, and at least a tit-for-tat strategy, and it could give some relief and condolence to the Korean people who has at least psychologically and emotionally suffered from the Japanese demand of the two not to give them money to the forced labor workers during the colonial era. So.
How do you gauge the impact of removing Japan from Korea's whitelist on the Japanese economy or Japanese firms?
Actually, as I told you earlier, that economically it's not, with respect to amount or the size of GDP, the magnitude is not big. But however, politically it has an impact because at least the people who spend money while traveling to Japan is reduced a lot, significantly. It could affect the local economy, particularly, even though the amount of the influence is very small, but however, it could have impact on the local people, population in Japan, and that could affect the Japanese government attitude, at least at the time of a political election period, then it could have some influence.
So the overall impact on the Japanese economy and Japanese firms will be limited, but certain local economies will be the hardest hit. Now, it's been a month and a half since Japan first slapped export curbs against South Korea. Some had anticipated that South Korean firms might suffer greatly, might have to go through a lot of difficulties and a lot of losses, while others remained quite optimistic that Japan's measures won't affect Korean firms all that much. How are Korean companies doing now?
I think when we look back, the Samsung and some companies has seem to be prepared for this kind of pressure from the Japanese government, because Japanese some concern has mounted on since last year. Therefore, some big companies in Korea has already tried to find some alternative source of the raw materials or other important resources which was imported from Japan. So now, and also government has been prepared, because in the Blue House, I don't know the official name, he's policy advisor to the president, Sang Kim. He has told that they have checked the list potential probation of the import by the Japanese government, and then be prepared and set up some budget for the sudden curtail from the import from Japan. So to that regard, I think we have managed relatively quite well.
Now, are Japan's export curbs against Korea beginning to be reflected in the Seoul Tokyo trade figures?
I beg your pardon, come again?
Japan's export curbs against Korea it's been a month and a half. Are those beginning to be reflected on the figures trade figures between Seoul and Tokyo?
Yeah, particularly in terms of the export and import, I have looked into the data and just taken out some numbers and also graph. From the graph, clearly, the same year monthly growth rate of the import from Japan has been significantly declining. Clearly, apparently it shows some trend, meaningful trend. Whereas also it is accompanied by the world trade decline, and the world economy is now on the downside. Therefore, that has clearly impacted, but import from Japan has been reduced significantly than the other countries, particularly than China and United States. However, the export from Korea to Japan has remained relatively stable. So to that regard, actually the net export, which accounts for huge part of the current balance, is explained. So that's why we have seen a little bit improvement in terms of the magnitude. The current balance looks improving right now.
We'll talk more about current account surplus, but first, meanwhile, the U.S. and China have agreed to resume talks next month. Do you expect some progress this time?
Yeah, right now I think that China has upper hand, because China has decided to remain until the next year's U.S. presidential election. And the presidential election is kind of some critical moment for the Trump, and also he might lose some power to maintain the trade war against China. And also, particularly in the December in the US, US people would like to spend and consume more, but without Chinese imports, the price will soar, and the cheap products are not available in December. Then I think Trump administration have to consider that situation, and then they would like to settle down the dispute before December. That is most likely scenario, which I consider right now.
Now, amid mounting external challenges, Korea's current account surplus, as you've mentioned, jumped to a 9-month high in July. How do you see this?
But actually, the absolute amount has been reached 6 billion and $949 million US dollars in July 2019. But however, before that, last year we have reached a much higher level of current balance. So we need to see that in order to interpret correctly what's going on the current balance, we have to see seasonally adjusted growth rate of current balance. Particularly the same year, the same month, the previous year's growth rate is seasonally adjusted growth rate. Then I can see that from last year, 2018's July, then clearly, apparently, the current balance growth rate is declining. So against Japan, so which means that even though current balance, the absolute amount looks improving right now a little bit, but that is not the true shape of the trend. So trend is declining, which means that because of the world trade is contracting, therefore the effect is realized in our current balance also.
Now, Korea's consumer price growth hit a record low in August, remaining unchanged at 0.0 from last year, but technically falling by 0.04%. What are the main causes of this minus growth?
This was estimated by the previous year, same month's growth rate of the consumer price index. But however, the reason is mainly the decline of the world trade, and then the demand is declining. Therefore, the price is also declining, particularly for the oils and raw materials. So that is the main force behind that declining. But also, particularly, there is some effect from the. There was a huge increase in the last years, particularly in the summer, particularly for the agricultural products, was affected by the climate. Last year and the previous, the year before the last year we have observed a very hot summer that could affect the agricultural crops has been declined substantially. But this year it's recovered, and therefore the price is declining. So, but for the manufacturing and the other services, prices has remained relatively a little bit high. But overall, we can see that right now the world economy is declining. That's the main force behind this kind of the low consumer price index.
Now, the record low consumer price growth has led to some concerns of a possible deflation. Do we need to be worried about deflation?
Not at all, because this is just one instance, and at least when the economy fall into deflation, which means the prices decline over the next 2 years. Of course, this could be some kind of arming that could harbinger that delivers the future decline of the deflation. But however, the government, they will not stay quietly at all. They have to spend and in order to enhance the growth rate of the economy, and they have some tools such as a fiscal policy, and even they could decline the interest. Particularly this situation in Korea, we have to spend fiscal policy, and then the government budget has been increased by 9.8%, which is it reached 5 trillion, 51 trillion Korean won. Therefore, to that regard, it is good news, at least in terms of the economic growth rate. The other one is, right now, our interest rate, basic interest rate remains constant. The Bank of Korea decided to keep the current interest rate correct. But however, as the deflation is declining, if the consumer price is declining, then the difference, which means that the real interest rate real interest rate is the nominal interest subtracted by the inflation. As the inflation becomes very small or close to zero, which means that real interest rate is increased, becomes bigger. That could be some kind of the hurdle or some blockade to the economic activities. Therefore, I think the Bank of Korea should consider next time they have to consider some reduction of interest rate, nominal interest rate.
All right, thank you, Dr. Song, for your insights tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
And that wraps up our show. Thank you, as always, for being with us.